Well, welcome again, everyone, on this beautiful Sabbath day here in Kentucky. We're moving closer to a time of year where the weather moderates just a bit, but it doesn't often get it very hot nor will it really get it very cold. At least it's like what it's like in Kentucky anyway. It should be a pleasant time. And speaking of a very pleasant time, what about the return of Jesus Christ? Now, I suppose things leading up to his return may not be very pleasant, but once his kingdom is established, then things will be indeed very pleasant. No, we're all looking forward to Christ's return. But since Jesus came the first time, practically every generation has believed that Jesus will return in their particular generation. Now, some of the more recent dates that were actually prophesied for Jesus' return have been like 1843, 1881, 1873, 1901, and of course the year 2000. Many of us might remember when Harold Camping claimed that the rapture and the judgment day would occur in 2011. Now, people actually mortgaged their homes to provide money to help get the word out. Of course, they likely regret doing that today, I'm sure. Even a former minister of the Worldwide Church of God predicted Jesus' return would be in 2011. When that didn't happen, it turned to 2012 and then 2013. Of course, Christ did not return on any of these predicted dates. But again and again, predictions of a specific date for the return of Christ have failed. Predictions of Christ's imminent return continue today, and they'll just continue just as they have in the past. From an article I just found on the ChristianPost.com website, let me read this to you. It says, quote, "A rabbi in Israel is predicting that Jesus Christ might return in 2022, that's this year, when astronomers foresee two large stars colliding and creating a light visible from Earth," close quote. This rabbi is basing the return of Jesus Christ on the possibility that two stars might collide this year. I'll say possibility because this phenomenon has never been observed before. And this may or may not actually happen this year. And there may be nothing to see, even if it does. But let's say this brightening does happen when these two stars collide as predicted, and it does happen this year. Our Bibles don't list this occurrence as a sign of Christ's return. And we know that Christ cannot return this year. We still have a tribulation to go through first, and that lasts at least 3.5 years. But predictions of various dates for the return of Christ persist. And of course, so far, all have failed. And this kind of reminds me of the story of the boy that cried wolf. Remember that story? Yeah. A young boy was attending his sheep when he cried out, "Wolf! The wolf is coming!" The nearby villagers heard the boy's cry and rushed right over, but of course, there was no wolf. The wolf didn't come. Didn't happen just once. This happened again and again. The boy cried, "Wolf!" The villagers got excited and ran to protect the boy's sheep. Now, eventually, the villagers began to assume that there probably was really no wolf coming. But once again, they heard the cry, "Wolf!" But this time, they just ignored it. There just couldn't be a real wolf, especially since they'd been fooled so many times before. But this time, there really was a wolf. But no one was ready. They ignored the pleas. Sheep were lost. In one version of this story, even the young boy was eaten. Well, like the boy that cried wolf, I feel that many today have heard people falsely predict the coming of Jesus Christ a few too many times. And when he does return, I fear they won't be ready. They won't take things seriously anymore. Turn with me to 2 Peter, if you would. That's 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 3. Now, it's not that we don't believe Christ will return one day. We do believe that. It's just that all these false predictions of his coming tend to maybe make us complacent. His return begins to feel, well, maybe so far off that it almost doesn't seem real to us anymore. So again, 2 Peter 3, verse 3. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. I know many today believe that since Jesus hasn't returned up to now, that he never will. They just go about their lives forgetting about Christ altogether. I know we don't do that, but I suspect these failed predictions about Christ's return might affect us in other ways. Those townspeople were not prepared when that wolf did finally appear. And I fear that some of us might not be prepared when Christ does return. And I do believe it could be in some of our actual lifetimes. Well, most today aren't looking for the return of Jesus Christ. No one's really looking for that anymore, it seems. And I believe that's in part due to all the failed predictions of his return. But should we be watching for his return? Should we be looking for that? As it turns out, the story of the boy who cried wolf is not really a good analog of the false predictions of the return of Jesus Christ. Turn over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, if you would. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. We'll start right there in verse 1. For those of you who might remember Don Knotts playing Luther Heggs in the movie The Ghost of Mr. Chicken? Well, as he might say, let me clarify this. Okay. All right. Anyway, those who do not really know God, his plan for us, and basic Bible prophecy for that matter, well, they really don't know when to expect Jesus' return. Now, they're completely clueless as to when he might appear. I believe that's why they're so willing to accept most any prediction that Jesus might return today or maybe tomorrow. But eventually, like that wolf that didn't show up, many give up on the return of Christ altogether, or at least they might put it out of their minds. But what about us, brethren? Should God's people be affected by these false prophecies? Should we be completely in the dark about when Christ will return? Well, what does Paul say? Again, that's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 1. But of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write to you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. That would seem to be unpredictable. And this is a bit of a general statement, because no one we know knows the day or the hour. But notice that Paul makes a distinction between the true followers of Jesus Christ and those who are not. Now, he speaks of those who do not truly know Christ in verse 3, and those that do know him in verse 4. Let's look at the difference. Again, in verse 3. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But notice verse 4. But you, brethren, and that's us, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. You are all children of the light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Paul says that we're children of the light. We've been given eyes to see. Now, hang on to where we are, if you would, right here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. So hold your place if you can. Let's run over briefly, if you would, to Matthew chapter 24. That's Matthew chapter 24, and we'll go to verse 23. Now, we have eyes to see that those predicting the return of Christ this year or even next will be wrong. But we should expect these false predictions to continue, because most people don't know what we know. Anyway, here Jesus is warning his disciples, and that includes us, of what they were to see to come. Again, Matthew 24, verse 23. If any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. So, Christ warned us that people would falsely prophesy about the time of his return. And they would be good at it too, because they would even deceive God's very elect if it was possible. And of course, that's what we see today. We see people all over the place predicting this date and that date. But we should know better. We, brethren, should not be deceived. Verse 26. Wherefore, if they say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers. Believe it not. Believe it not. Those that understand God's plan know that much prophecy is yet to be fulfilled before Christ will return. So we should just basically ignore all those who are making these false claims about the return of Christ. And we know better. And Jesus warned us about them ahead of time. But with so many crying wolf so often, should we just forget about his return for now, like many are doing? It seems like everybody's buying into this. He's coming tomorrow, or he's not coming at all. But we know it will eventually happen one day. Jesus Christ will return. So maybe we should just forget about it until he actually returns. What do you think? Is that what we should do? Just forget about it and wait for it to happen? What does Paul think about this? Let's head back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 4. I hope you kept your place there. We'll back up a couple of verses from where we actually stopped. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 4. Let's continue with Paul. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. You are all children of the light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Verse 6. Therefore, let us not sleep as do others. Others that may grow tired of hearing that Jesus was returning when he didn't. Those that are asleep today. So if we're not to sleep, what are we to do? Well, let's continue in verse 6. But let us watch and be sober. Paul tells us to watch for the true signs of Jesus' return. The signs Jesus told us about because he wanted us to know. We can find those signs in places like Matthew 24 and Luke 21, Mark 13, and actually in all kinds of places throughout our Bibles. Verse 7. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us, who are of the day, be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. Now, we should be excited about our salvation, and we should be very excited about even the thought of Christ's return. I think we should be eagerly waiting for the time when the rule of man, aided by Satan, ends, and the rule of Jesus Christ begins. How could God's people not be excited and watching for prophecy to be fulfilled, watching for signs of the return of Jesus Christ? I would think we'd have to do that. Of course, but not from made-up signs from those who truly don't know who Jesus Christ really is. But we can, and I believe we should, watch for the signs Jesus gave us. We should not be in darkness as others are today. We should watch and be prepared for his return. In fact, let's turn over to Luke chapter 12, if you would. That's Luke chapter 12, verse 35, and see if that relates to what we're talking about. We'll look at a parable Jesus told of waiting for one's master to return from a wedding party. And Jesus will explain this parable to us. Now, by the way, I'll be reading this in the easy-to-read version of the Bible. It'll be a little different probably than what you have. But again, Luke chapter 12, verse 35. Here Jesus says, Be ready, be fully dressed, and have your light shining. Be like servants who are waiting for their master to come home from a wedding party. The master comes and knocks, and the servants immediately open the door for him. Now, how was it that the servants opened the door immediately for their master? Well, it's probably because they knew he was coming. They weren't surprised. Verse 37. When their master sees that they are ready and waiting for him, it will be a great day for those servants. I can tell you without a doubt, the master will get himself ready to serve a meal and tell the servants to sit down. Then he will serve them. Those servants might have to wait until midnight or later for their master, but they will be glad they did when he comes in and finds them still waiting. These servants may not have known the exact time that their master would return, but they certainly had a good idea of when it would be, and they patiently and eagerly waited for him to arrive. Verse 41. Peter said, Lord, Did you tell this story for us or for all people? As we continue in verse 42, we'll see there's more going on here than just simply waiting for their master to return. Remember, we're talking about the servants of their master here. Now, this is a parable. Who might this be referring to? Well, I believe the servants represent us, and the master, Jesus Christ. So let's go ahead with verse 42 as Jesus explains this parable. The Lord said, "Who is the wise and trusted servant? The master trusts one servant to give the other servants their food at the right time. Who is the servant that the master trusts to do that work?" Now again, I suspect that the servant here that God trusts to do his work represents those that are called today for God's purpose. Verse 43. When the master comes and finds him, the servant, doing the work he gave him, it will be a day of blessing for that servant. So what happens if Christ, our master, returns and finds us doing the work he gave us to do? Well, we will be blessed. But do we know what our master, Jesus Christ, has called us to do? Do we understand the purpose of our calling? We should be eager to fulfill the purpose God called us for. And if we're doing the work he's given us, what might we expect when he returns? Verse 44. Jesus says, "I can tell you without a doubt, the master will choose that servant to take care of everything he owns." Wow. Now that servant, the one that's doing the will of God and fulfilling the purpose for which he's called, will be put in charge of everything. It might remind us of Joseph in the house of Potiphar. Remember that story? Okay. See some parallels there. So, what might we expect to happen to us if Christ returns to find us being faithful servants? Again, Jesus says, "I can tell you without a doubt," Jesus is sure about this, no ambiguity, "the master will choose that servant to take care of everything he owns." So if we're found to be faithful servants at the return of Christ, then we will be chosen. Chosen for what? Well, chosen to take care of everything, even important matters. Chosen to rule alongside Christ in his millennial kingdom. After all, we can be trusted to take care of everything he owns. Well, that's heavy. But contrary to what most teach today, God is not calling everyone to salvation now, nor is he calling everyone to serve in his kingdom. Now, if he's called you, for example, if you're now seeing through Satan's deception, if you're seeing the truth out there, what purpose might he have for you? Well, most likely, those called at this time are ultimately being called to assist with the kingdom of God. There might be some specific tasks that will be called upon to perform now. But what we do today will help prepare the way for God's coming kingdom. And that's God's ultimate goal, and it should be ours too. But not all that are called will become the faithful servants that God seeks. We know that many are called, but actually few are chosen. So what about those that, let's say, don't bother to watch for his coming? What about those that sleep and don't pay attention? Maybe even lose their focus and ultimately don't answer God's calling. Let's look at verse 45. But what will happen if that servant is evil and thinks his master will not come back soon? He will begin to beat the other servants, men and women. He will eat and drink until he's had too much. That doesn't sound very good. Verse 46. Then the master will come when the servant is not ready, at a time when the servant is not expecting him. Then the master will punish that servant and send him away to be with the other people who don't obey. Now this servant will probably not be one of those chosen to help Christ rule in his kingdom. The servant will probably end up in the second resurrection at best. So how did this servant lose his crown, you might say, to rule as a king and priest in the millennium? Well, verse 47. That servant knew what his master wanted him to do, but he did not make himself ready or try to do what his master wanted. So that servant will be punished very much. Okay. But then again, what about all those Christians out there, those traditional Christians that have not been called yet? Those that celebrate Christmas and Easter. Those that are breaking God's commandments, although they often aren't aware that they are, because they're not yet called. They don't know any better. So, still, won't they be punished for their sin? Verse 48. But what about the servant who does not know what his master wants? Now, these are those, like I said, who have not yet been called. Their eyes have not been opened. They don't understand God completely. They really don't know what he wants. But still, continuing, he also does things that deserve punishment. But he will get less punishment than the servant who knew what he should do. Those yet to be called, those that don't know any better, are still responsible for sin. But those who have been called, and those that know better, are likely to be in a lot bigger trouble. Notice the rest of verse 48. Whoever has been given much will be responsible for much. Much more will be expected from the one who has been given more. You know, we've all been given different gifts. We may not all be called to do the exact same thing right now. You know, Paul tells us in Ephesians 4, verse 16, in the easy-to-read version, all the parts of the body are joined and held together, with each part doing its own work. This causes the whole body to grow and to be stronger in love. But at any rate, along with our great calling comes great responsibility. God gives all that he calls the gifts and the resources to fulfill the purpose of his calling. We're all part of the body, but each one of us, of course, is a different part, perhaps performing different tasks. I even suspect that those serving in the Millennium might have some special talent, or they might be given some special gifts, in addition to acting as kings and priests. Let's turn over to Revelation 14, if you would. That's Revelation chapter 14. We'll begin there in verse 1. I want to take a look at the time when Christ does return, and humans will be redeemed from the earth. Now, these humans will be changed to spirit beings, join Jesus Christ, and make up the total of the first fruits unto God. Again, that's Revelation 14, beginning in chapter 1. And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. We're coming back to that number, by the way. Having his Father's name written in their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. And they sung as it were a new song before the throne, and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth. Now again, we see the number 144,000 mentioned as being the number of those redeemed from the earth. Verse 4. These are they which were not defiled with women. Now, many believe that not being defiled with women is a reference to not participating in Babylon. In other words, no idolatry, no false worship. Only the worship of the real God. Worship in true spirit and in truth. Let's continue in verse 4 rather. For they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb wheresoever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being the firstfruits unto God and to the Lamb. In their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. These are pretty cool people here. Those being described here, of course, are those in the first resurrection, and those belonging to Christ who are alive at his coming. Their number is listed as 144,000. Now, there are some that believe this is not a literal number, but they typically agree that the number in the first resurrection will be relatively small, at least compared to the time when the rest of the dead are resurrected. I remember a while back someone telling me that the Bible could not possibly be correct about this. There's no way. They said it is impossible for only 144,000 to be in that first resurrection. What was their logic? How would they prove this? How could they make the claim that there simply had to be more than 144,000 in the first resurrection? Well, this is a true story. Someone actually asked me this. Now, here's their answer and their logic. See if you can follow along with this. They maintained that everyone, that's everyone who had ever been a part of the old worldwide church of God, would be in that first resurrection. Now, since all told, there were actually more than 144,000 people total in this church, then there would have to be at least as many in the first resurrection as there were in this church, since this was the true church. But just belonging to a certain church or being in a specific group of people guarantee us a place in the millennium as kings and priests of our Lord? Of course not, no. The real church of God is not a specific man-made organization. It's made up of true believers of Jesus Christ wherever they might be found, which I believe are those which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ, as we read in Revelation 12, verse 17. But membership in a group doesn't automatically assure us a place as kings and priests at the beginning of the kingdom. Remember that many are called, but few are chosen. It's not about which organization we belong to or who we might associate with. It's about a relationship with God. Will everyone in that former organization I mentioned earlier be in the first resurrection? I'd say that's not likely. Well, if not, who exactly will be in that first resurrection? How about that? Well, I can't really say. It's not my call. Those who are to be kings and priests in the millennium will be chosen by God to fulfill his purpose. His ultimate purpose is the creation of his great kingdom and for us to eventually be in it. We know that one day all will be called. All will have the opportunity to enter God's kingdom. But for today, not everyone's being called, not just yet. But if we are being called to serve God today and in his coming kingdom in the future, can we even begin to comprehend the magnitude of our calling? I think we take this way too much for granted. Think just a moment back about Jesus' original 12 disciples. We remember them, don't we? Can we imagine, just for a minute, being one of them? Pick one, maybe. Be one. Hope he's not Judas. Okay. But how would we have felt? Would we have been excited to work with Jesus Christ in person? You know, few then had the opportunity to serve in the way his disciples did. What a blessing. How many of us would like to have been one of those original 12 disciples? That'd be cool. That could have been great. But, they were more than just servants of Jesus Christ. Turn to John 15, verse 14, if you would. That's John chapter 15. We'll look at verse 14. Jesus' disciples were more than just servants. They were his friends. But how did they come to be Jesus' disciples? Did they invite themselves? Did they just catch up with him and ask to hang out with him? Well, again, let's look at John 15, verse 14. Here's what Jesus says there to his disciples. And I say to us as well, we're his disciples. You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. In other words, keep his commandments. Henceforth, I call you not servants, for the servant knows not what his Lord does. But I've called you friends, for all things that I've heard of my Father I have made known unto you. I believe that what Jesus said to his disciples in this next verse applies just as much to us today as it did to the original 12 then. See what you think. Verse 16. You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you. Now, the word ordained here is a Greek 5087 in Strong's. It's tatheme, and it means to appoint, to purpose. God has chosen us, just as he did the original 12 disciples around 2,000 years ago. Not everybody's been called. Think about that. What was God's purpose in choosing them and in choosing us, if he has? Let's continue. That you should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatsoever you shall ask of the Father in my name, he may give it to you. The Contemporary English Version reads, same verse, you did not choose me. I chose you and sent you out to produce fruit, the kind of fruit that will last. Then my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. So what is the difference between those called today and Jesus' original 12 disciples? There may be a few, but if you think about it, there's not a lot of difference. All were or are called and ordained to be servants of God and given a purpose. And God can call us, but of course, we still have the option to reject that call. Just look at what happened to Judas. The same can happen to us. Our calling is not a guarantee that we will be serving in God's kingdom. We still need to fulfill the purpose of our calling. If we're to serve in God's kingdom, is there something we need to do? Is there some action we should take? What do you think? Well, I'd say yes. I believe we need to learn and grow closer to God, for one thing, learn more about him. I think we need to prepare to be leaders in the coming kingdom. You know, God's holy days, among other things, are rehearsals. We teach that every year. These rehearsals are in part to prepare us for the kingdom. We need to be rehearsing for the kingdom today. How do we do that? Well, several ways, actually. We need to be showing the love to others that we'll be showing in the kingdom. We need to obey God's commandments today because we'll be teaching them to others in the millennium. We might even be teaching others today, assuming, of course, that they'll listen. Most won't. We need to stay away from idolatry completely. We don't even dabble in things God doesn't approve of. We don't want to even give the slightest appearance of idolatry. We want to come completely out of Babylon. No compromise with Satan's counterfeits. None at all. Let's take a brief look at what might be happening in the millennium to see what we might be doing or what might be going on. Let's take a look at the beginning of Christ's reign in the millennium, and let's do that by going to Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 1. Let's see an example of how things might go in the millennium. Might we see an example of what we might be teaching those in the millennium? Of course, we'll see this in much greater detail at this year's Feast of Tabernacles. But anyway, let's look briefly at Zechariah, beginning at chapter 14 and verse 1. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, and your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you. For I shall gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. I believe we're talking about the Battle of Armageddon here. And the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half the city shall go forth into captivity. And the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth, and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. Let's drop down to verse 8, if you would, verse 8. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea. In summer and winter shall it be. And verse 9. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one. Okay, now here we're obviously seeing the beginning of Christ's reign in his great kingdom. Let's drop down to verse 16. That's Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 16. And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and, notice this, to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. We see that people will be keeping the Feast of Tabernacles in the millennium. Of course, we know that's one of God's commandments today. If we plan to teach others in the millennium, then we certainly should be keeping God's commandments today. We should be setting a good example now. Well, back to the scripture. What if people decide not to keep God's Feast of Tabernacles, or let's say presumably fail to keep another of God's commandments? Will they get away with it, you might say? What happens then? Then what? Let's see in verse 17. And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. And what if that doesn't convince people to attend the feast or to come up? Verse 18. And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, that they have no rain, then there shall be the plague, wherewith the Lord shall smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, this is just one example, but we see here that, I'm sure you see the broad picture. God's laws will be observed during the millennium. And that's part of what makes it so great. We're living under God's law. It's great. But if we don't follow God's laws now, after He's called us and given us understanding, why would He want us to teach others in the kingdom when we don't obey Him today? Now, my opinion is that there are two factors in joining Christ when He returns and establishes His kingdom. What would it take to be one of those in that first resurrection, or to be changed at His return? I believe the first thing probably required is that we need to be called by God. In John 6, verse 44, Jesus tells us, "No man can come to me, except the Father which has sent me draw him." So I believe we need to be called by God for His purpose. And that's not something everybody's being called for today. And without God's calling, well, we know it's practically impossible to actually come to know the true God. Think about this for a moment. The vast majority of the Christian world out there has yet to be called. Not a lot are being called today. They still don't know who God really is. Now, God's purpose for those He calls today is to help others now, and to be in the millennium to help teach others the ways of God then. That's what I believe anyway. Now, if called on to do that today, what would most Christians be doing? The traditional Christians, those that aren't called, let's say. What would they be teaching? Well, they'd probably be teaching about Christmas trees and Easter bunnies and Easter eggs. Maybe they teach about some aspects of Halloween. I don't know. How many of them would teach the people about God's true Sabbath? This seventh-day Sabbath and His annual Sabbaths. We just saw where people will be observing the Feast of Tabernacles in the millennium. But most Christians today, without God's calling, well, they just don't understand this. Now, again, it's not that they're bad people. It's not that they lack intelligence. These are good people. I can tell you, I've seen many great people that love God, but they continue to keep the counterfeit holy days, or holidays, I should say, yet they're really good people. A great many of them really love God and others. They do the very best they can, but what's the problem? They're deceived. But they likely won't find themselves teaching others the ways of God in His kingdom, because they really need to be called first, that deception exposed, so that they can truly come to know the true Jesus Christ. And of course, there may have been some that have been called today and shown basic truth about God and His great plan for man, but they've rejected it. Some actually prefer to remain in darkness despite being given the precious gift of this knowledge. And it's really those I'm probably the most concerned about. But if God desires some of us to help teach those in the millennium about Him and His ways, how likely would He be to choose someone who only knows about Satan's counterfeit holy days or holidays? And how likely would He be to choose someone who saw but rejected God's ways? So again, I don't mean to speak for God, but I would think that He would choose those that He called and prepared for His purpose and that responded to his call. Let's turn over to Revelation chapter 2, if you would. That's Revelation chapter 2, and again, we'll start right there in verse 1. Not only do we need to produce fruit, as those called, we need to keep producing it. We never want to become complacent. We never want to forget our first love. Again, Revelation 2, verse 1. And to the angel of the church of Ephesus write, These things, said he, that holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. I know your works, and your labor, and your patience, and how you cannot bear them which are evil. And you have tried them which say they're apostles, and are not, and have found them liars. Well, here it seems that those in the church are being praised for what they're doing. They're not tolerating sin or evil. They're discerning who's a leader and who's not to be trusted. They appear to be proving things to themselves. That's a good thing. Verse 3. And is born and has patience, and for my name's sake has labored and has not fainted. In other words, they've not grown weary. So these people sound like some really good people. But verse 4. Nevertheless, I have somewhat against you, because you have left your first love. I'll reread that again in the International Standard Version. However, I have this against you. You've abandoned the love you first had. I think probably most of us today have been at this for some time. Can we think back to how it was when we first learned of the truth? Do you remember that day? We were talking about that the other night in a Bible study. Can you think back about the time when you first learned the truth? Can we recall the exhilaration, the excitement we had? Remember that? I do. I know most of us couldn't stop ourselves from trying to share the truly good news with everybody, despite, of course, realizing that most don't want to hear it. But what's happened to some of us? Why don't we still have that same zeal, that same love for this that we originally had? Maybe some of us do. But I would suggest we all examine ourselves to see if we might potentially be becoming lukewarm today. Let's go to verse 5. If that's the case, verse 5. Remember therefore from whence you are fallen, and repent, and do the first works, or else I will come unto you quickly, and will remove my candlestick out of his place, except you repent. Again, verse 5 in the Contemporary English Version. Think about where you've fallen from, and then turn back and do as you did at first. If you don't turn back, I will come and take away your lampstand. We need to maintain the zeal we had when we first came into the truth, when we first came into the church. When Christ does return, we want to be ready for him, doing the work he gave us or ordained us to do. Of course, then, that will truly be a day of blessing for us. And if we're not living at the time of his coming, really the same thing applies. The only difference is that we'll be resurrected instead of being changed in the twinkling of an eye. I'd like to add, before we get finished today, that while previous generations did believe that Christ would come back then, we do find many of the signs that Jesus and others spoke of in our Bibles are being seen today. Those are signs they didn't have back then. And those include what I believe. What I believe is the great sign John related to us in Revelation 12. That's something they didn't see. So saying this, I can't make a prediction of tomorrow or whatever. Of course, we know it'll be a few years yet. But personally, I believe it won't be long now. It truly won't be long now until the return of Jesus Christ. Will we be ready? Will he find us continuing to study his word? Will we be keeping his commandments? Or are we fudging sometimes saying he won't care? Will we be showing love to others as he commanded us? Will we be helping the widows, the orphans, the poor? Maybe we can teach others if they'll listen. Have we earnestly prayed and asked God what he would have us to do today and to prepare for his kingdom? Have we asked him? Will we be a shining example to others? Or will we hide our lantern under a basket? But we do know that one day Christ will return. Will we be ready?